If I can, I just want to start with a little bit of framing around what we're going to study. First of all, I want to warn ahead of time, if there are any children present, there's some texts that we're going to look at that are probably not appropriate for children. Some of the texts we're going to look at are a little bit R-rated. Just want to give you a heads up on that as we're getting ready to go there. Why do we read the Book of Ruth on Shavuot? Ruth is generally associated with the holiday of Shavuot. Clearly, the most obvious reason is the action of it, the main action of it takes place during the holiday of Shavuot, and during the holiday, not of Shavuot, because there was no Shavuot at that point, but takes place during the harvest that was associated later on with Shavuot. But I think it's also the rabbis connected with Shavuot because Shavuot celebrates the time of Matan Torah, the time of giving of Torah, and Ruth, in the other side of it, takes on Kabbalat Torah. Ruth takes on to herself the reception of Torah. And as we know, we often refer to her as the first person to formally convert, and we will look at that text just for a little bit. But I was also inspired by something that Ruthie spoke about as we began our Leil Tikkun Shavuot this evening. She spoke about the power of language, and she spoke about the language of the heart and the language of the mind. And I think maybe there's also something here to that in the sense of that Ruth represents that combination. She brings the language of Torah into her heart, and she represents, as we're told, when Torah is given, Torah is given in 70 different languages, languages of all the peoples of that time. And she represents one of those people accepting Torah in her own language, perhaps, as each of us studies Torah in our own language. So what I'd like to do is let's go into a little bit of studying some of the text of Ruth and see why she is so powerful for us and where this text is going to take us. Oops, give me 1 second. All right. So Ruth, the stranger, and the Messiah. Who are the various characters who are involved in this text? Now, we're not actually going to start with the story of Ruth. We're going to start with Genesis. And if there's somebody who would be willing to, I would love it if somebody would be willing to read the text for us as we go along, so we have more than just my voice speaking. So whoever would like to, just go ahead and unmute yourself. You can read the Hebrew, you can read the English, whichever one you prefer.
And God said, let us make humans in our, it's cut off here, I'm sorry. In our image, after our likeness, they shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth.
Keep on going, take the next little.
Sure. And God created humans in God's image. In the image of God, God created them, male and female, he created them.
Okay. So the key idea here is the idea of being created in the image of God. We're all very familiar with this text. It's perhaps one of the most commonly quoted Jewish texts. Just real quickly, when you think about being created in the image of God, what does that phrase, image of God, mean to us as we think about it? You know, the way I like to think about it is it's clearly not about us physically looking like God. And already Maimonides and many of the other great rabbis throughout the history have talked about, clearly it's not us looking like God, because all you have to do is look at all the little faces in the boxes and you see that we all look very different. Some of us are tall and some of us are short and some of us are white and some of us are darker skinned and some of us are male and some of us are female and some of us are, and you keep on filling in the blanks, and we all look very different as human beings. There is no such thing as a human image. And so the rabbis play with this, and then the next they play with the idea of what does it mean to be in the image of God? It means to be able to act in God-like ways. Oops, I went too far. And if somebody could read this next text for us, just to give us a sense of what this might look like. It doesn't use the word of image of God. It means here it talks about walking in the ways of God. If someone would like to read this for us.
And Rabbi Hama, son of Rabbi Hanina, says, what is the meaning of that which is written, after the Lord your God shall you walk? More?
Yep, read the whole thing.
Just as he clothes the naked, as it is written, and the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skin and clothed them, so too should you clothe the naked. Just as the Holy One, blessed be he, visits the sick, as it is written with regards to God's appearing to Abraham following his circumcision. And the Lord appeared unto him by the terebinths of Mamre. So too should you visit the sick. Just as the Holy One, blessed be he, consoles mourners, as it is written, and it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed Isaac, his son, so too should you console mourners. Just as the Holy One, blessed be he, buried the dead, as it is written, and he was buried in the valley in the land of Moab, so too should you bury the dead.
So again, first I want to apologize for the sexist language in the text. It's not the language that I would normally use, especially when referring to God. But then I also just want to say, again, here, what is this really about? What does it mean to walk like God? What does it mean to be in God's image? It's about acting in God-like ways. We're going to want to keep that in mind when we come to the end of our study. So now we're going to go on to reading a little bit of the Book of Ruth. And we need to figure out, who is this woman Ruth? Where does she come from? It's a story many of us are probably familiar with. Let me take the opportunity to read a little bit. We know that there was a famine in the land. Elimelech and his wife Naomi go down to, and where do they go down to?
Moab.
They go down to Moab. And what happens in Moab? Their two sons, they marry.
The two sons marry, and
right?
They die.
They die. And Naomi is left by herself with her two daughter-in-laws. In the meantime, she's heard that the famine has ended in the land of Israel. And so she heads back to the land of Israel. And we get that famous line. Who would like to read it for us? In the middle of the page that's in front of us.
But Ruth replied, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God.
Keep on going.
Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you. When Naomi saw how determined she was to go with her, she ceased to argue with her.
So this is the famous line which is quoted over and over again about Ruth and the power of Ruth. And Ruth allies her life with Naomi's, and Ruth, and effectively, this is her conversion ceremony. But we need to stop and look for a minute. Who is this woman Ruth, and who are the Moabites? What do we know about Moab? And here is where we're going to get a little bit juicier with our text. This is the first origin story of the story of Ruth, of Moab. This picks up with the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. Just to give you the background, remember, Lot is living in Sodom. Sodom is going to be destroyed. Lot flees with his wife and his daughters from Sodom. His wife turns back, looks, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. Lot and his daughters keep on going. And somebody pick up the text for us.
I'll read.
Thank you.
Okay. Lot went up from Zoar and settled in the hill country with his two daughters, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. And he and his two daughters lived in a cave. And the older one said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to consort with us in the way of all the world.
Right? Remember what they've just seen. They've just seen the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah completely destroyed, and they assume the entire world has been destroyed, and it's just the three of them left.
Come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may maintain life through our father. That night they made their father drink wine, and the older one went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. That next day, the older one said to the younger, see, I lay with father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, and you go and lie with him, that we may maintain life through our father.
Oops.
The older one bore a son and named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites of today. And the younger also bore a son, and she called him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites of today.
All right, so what is the origin story of Moab?
Incest.
Incest. One of the most prohibited of relationships throughout all cultures. That's the origin story of Ruth and of Moab. And we know that we should never be involved in incestuous relationships, but then we're also told, somebody go ahead and read the text for us.
No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. None of their descendants, even in the 10th generation, shall ever be admitted into the congregation of the Lord.
Wait a second. How do you put together these three texts that we've just read?
It's me.
Ruth is held up as this ideal. Ruth is held up, right?
The two sons married Moabite women. They didn't have to do. Not only didn't they didn't have to. They weren't supposed to ever.
Ah, but it's not just that they married her, but then Ruth is now taken back to the
Well,
land
yes,
of.
I mean, but she has that relationship with her mother-in-law.
She has that relationship with him.
So the other Moabite woman, turns back and goes home to her gods and her people.
I was curious to know whether Ruth converted before marrying the sons of Naomi, or only after the sons of Naomi died, and then Ruth went with Naomi back to Israel. Is that the point when she converted, or did she convert?
No, she converts at that moment.
She converts at that moment.
I mean, that's what it seems to be.
Yeah, the text certainly does seem to suggest that.
And it's based on love. It's based on love.
And it's based on love for Naomi, not
Yes.
love of her husband who's long dead.
Well, no, he's not long dead. He's dead.
He's dead, right. Now, I do want to conscious us. We do have to be careful of using the word conversion here, because in the ancient world, there was no conversion ceremony per se.
Yeah.
You got married and you became part of your husband's tribe.
Yes.
If Ruth is a Moabite, then she's not allowed to go to the congregation of the Lord. So how could she be what she became?
Great.
Are they referring to women, men only?
No. No Ammonite or
Right.
Moabite.
Well, different interpretations, different authors.
Perhaps.
I think this is a revolutionary, radical act on the part of the person who wrote the Book of Ruth.
And wait and see where we're going to go next. And I think you're heading in the right direction. And I think where I'm going to keep in our mind different languages.
Mhm.
Language of the heart, language of the mind, language of the law, and language of reality. Language of the ideal, and language what happens.
Yeah.
Right? All right, we're going to jump now to the end of the Book of Ruth. We're going to skip a little bit. The whole book is all in 4 chapters, so we didn't skip that much, but we're going to skip some. Ruth, goes out to glean because that's the only way she can support herself and Naomi. And she meets Boaz, and Boaz is the redeemer. Boaz is the one who has now the responsibility for her, because he is the next of kin, in a sense. Who would like to read the text?
Well, actually, there was a kin who was even closer.
Thank you. You're right.
But he refused to marry Ruth.
Yep.
And the story doesn't really give his name. I think they call him Ploni Almoni, which is, I guess, something like John Smith or something like this. They don't really.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you, James. You're right on that.
Mhm.
All right. So Boaz takes her. Who wants to read the end of the story for us here?
I'll read. And Boaz said to the elders and to the rest of the people, "You are witnesses today that I am acquiring from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Machlon. I am also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Machlon, as my wife. so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate, that the name of the deceased may not disappear from among his kinsmen and from the gate of his hometown. You are witnesses today. So Boaz married Ruth. She became his wife, and he cohabited with her. The Lord let her conceive, and she bore a son. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David.
Okay. So, and who is this David, by the way?
David is the king,
David is the king, exactly. This is King David.
the ancestor of the Messiah.
Very good. And so what have we just learned? David's great-grandmother is a Moabite, somebody who you should never marry into that family of. And if we went back enough generations, David's ancestors is the result of incest, this forbidden sexual relationship, these people who you should outcast forever. How about Boaz? Anybody know his family story?
No.
Oops.
Oh, Judah? Oh my
He
God.
There you go. Boaz comes from the story of
Woohoo!
Judah and Tamar. Anybody remember the story of Judah and Tamar? We don't necessarily need to go through the entire text.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Helen, if I can ask you.
Yeah, well, he's she's a daughter-in-law, and she's a widow, and she lives in her father's house, and then the wife of Judah died. She's also a widow.
So Judah.
Oh, Judah wants his daughter-in-law Tamar to stay
Judah,
a widow until his son grows up, and then she'll get married to him. But she can't wait. So when he becomes a widower.
Hold on, Helen, a second. Let me jump in. So sure. Judah marries off his son heir to this woman Tamar. Before Tamar can conceive, heir dies.
Heir dies. Yeah.
In the ancient world, when your brother dies and he hasn't conceived a child, it was your responsibility as the next in line, the next brother, to marry his wife and to conceive a child with her, and that child would be attributed to your deceased brother. Onan, heir's next oldest brother, marries Tamar, but he doesn't really want to conceive a child. And so the text often says, I don't know if this text translates the same way.
He spills his seed.
Upon the ground. And God is displeased with him and struck him down dead. Now, just to give a little sense to this, when I was in rabbinic school, I had a roommate who was not a rabbinical student. He had a bird, and he called his bird Onan, because Onan spilled the seed all over the place. So Tamar says, hey, Judah, where's son number 3? And Judah says, I'm sorry, son number 3 is young. Wait till he grows up. When he grows up, I'll send him to you. Thinking to himself, oh my God, this woman's killed 2 of my kids. I'm going to let her have a 3rd one? What are you, crazy? Years go by, or some time go by. Judah does not send the son.
No.
Judah's wife has now died. Judah is on his way to do some errands. Tamar hears that she's on the way. Mm-hmm. She dresses up as a cultic prostitute, as a prostitute. Mm-hmm. Judah sees her, says, fantastic. He sleeps with her. Judah's not too smart. He forgot to bring his wallet with him. Mm-hmm. And he says, here's my signet ring, here's my staff. I'll send you the money tomorrow morning. Mm-hmm. Tomorrow morning, she's nowhere to be found. And then it comes back to him several months later. Tamar is pregnant. How could that be? She's been playing a prostitute. What's going on here? And then somebody read for us beginning verse 24.
About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. In fact, she is with child by harlotry. Bring her out, said Judah, and let her be burned.
Keep on going.
As she was being brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law. I am with child by the man to whom these belong. And she added, examine these, whose seal and cord and staff are these. Judah recognized them and said, she is more, she is more in the right than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he was not intimate with her again. When the
Once
time
was enough.
Huh?
Once was enough.
Once was enough. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one of them put out his hand, and the midwife tied a crimson thread on that hand to signify this one came out first. But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother, and she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. So he was named Perez.
Oh, does that name strike anybody yet?
It's the same story of one brother thinking that he's the firstborn and the other one takes his place.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
yeah. Oh, that one, that story.
Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau.
Jacob and Esau, right? And we know from Leviticus, you should never sleep with your daughter-in-law. We don't need Leviticus to tell us that, but we know that that's completely against God's rule. Where does this name Perez come from?
Well, they say Perez is breach, but I don't understand that quite.
I'm asking, you answered the question I asked, not the question I meant to ask.
From Ruth.
Right. Read verse 4. Read us again back to Ruth.
Here we go. Boaz's father, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather. 3 greats.
So
4 greats.
we've got a lot of greats in here, but what have we just discovered? When we take the story of Ruth and we take Boaz, what have we brought here?
They both come from
Incest.
from ancestral lineage.
They both come from ancestral lineage. They both come from people who should be the outcasts. They both come from those who we should are the other. And what has our text and our tradition done with the other? It has beautifully brought these two others together and made them
The ancestors of David, who becomes the ancestor of the Messiah.
Yeah. And therefore, what is perhaps our tradition trying to teach us with this story of Ruth and making sure that we read this story of Ruth, especially on Shavuot?
You shouldn't let your family background hold you back?
Don't let your family background hold you back.
I don't know.
We
Yeah,
are
I think
one
that's-
with the other.
That you can rise above, the reputation or the lineage of your family.
It's more than that. You're going to be accepted into this holy people who are keeping God's commandments.
We
But
are
also-
one.
Or
Welcome
want
the
to,
other.
or trying to, or
You know,
trying to.
welcome the stranger, welcome the other, and honor the other.
And
The other may wind up begetting your Messiah.
But not everything that God has said comes to pass, because he has said no Moabite or the descendants of a Moabite. And here we have David.
right? So
we're constantly reminded to remember the stranger, because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. This is an example of what that means ultimately, and it contradicts what some would think are the more particularistic teachings in the Torah.
right? The commandment that's repeated most often in the Torah is not about Shabbat. It's not belief in God. It's not circumcision. It's not whatever other things. It is about do not oppress the widow, the stranger, and the orphan, because you were the stranger. You know what it's like. But here the text takes it, I think, the Torah tradition takes it one step further. Not only should you not oppress them, but remember, they might ultimately become your salvation. That stranger.
That's what I said, to become your Messiah.
Exactly. They will become your Messiah.
Shocking.
Yeah. Right? Now they become your Messiah, and King David and King Solomon are greatest kings and rulers who perhaps ever lived in according to our tradition. And then ultimately we're awaiting the Messiah to come out of that.
That's great.
And now I want to bring us to the 21st century and to the moment where we are today in terms of thinking about what's happening in Eretz HaKodesh, in the Holy Land today, when we think about what's happening in Israel, and take us back, both keeping this image in our mind that we've just looked at, and the idea that the Messiah comes from the stranger, from the other who we want to outcast, but we realize he ultimately will become our Savior, but also taking us back to the imagery that we first spoke about with being created in God's image. And this was something, she didn't use this phrase, but for those of us who were studying with Rabbi Jill Jacobs at the beginning of the evening, one of the things that kept on going through my mind as she was teaching, and this makes it a really nice inclusio that we're going to end and begin in the similar areas, is we struggle with which is holier. There's a tension in the Jewish tradition about the holiness of the land versus the holiness of the people. And clearly what Rabbi Jacobs was teaching us, and I fully support where she was going with this and agree with her, is ultimately our tradition comes down with the idea that the holiness of people is much more important than the holiness of the land. And she gave us some great sources to be able to think about that. I also want to pick up a little bit from Rabbi David Hartman. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the writings of David Hartman. He's was a modern Orthodox rabbi. For many years was in Montreal and then ultimately moved to Jerusalem, where he started the Hartman Institute, which his son Daniel now continues. An amazing place of Torah study and pluralistic Torah study in Israel. Hartman writes, what Jews, Christians, and Muslims need to learn afresh is that God's creation of all human beings in God's image must have central importance in the interpretation of our religious tradition. Within Judaism, giving primacy to the prevention of human suffering is implicit in the halakhic rulings. As you know, pikuach nefesh is the highest principle in Jewish life. You break all the laws in order to preserve a human life. You break all the laws to save a human life. Then he goes on to write, the holiness of the land does not hinge on whether we speak of the occupied territories, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. If we are seriously concerned with the holiness of Israel, with God's indwelling in the land, then it is imperative that we ask, what will happen to the moral character of the nation? What will become of our Jewish and Judaic heritage if we dispossess or subjugate a vast population? If we lose our moral character, if we stop seeing the other as being created in God's image as we are created in God's image, then we've lost what Judaism is all about. And then we will have lost Israel as a Jewish state, let alone as a democratic state. He is trying to teach us. And I continue to quote, if we build our national life while ignoring the moral demands that come from belief in creation, we significantly undermine our belief in the unity of God, of creation, and the covenantal God of history. We started with creation. We started at the beginning of being in God's image. And we jumped from creation to the end of time to the Messiah. And remember that in between, we need to remember that the other, the stranger, is the person who's ultimately going to perhaps bring us to that sense of redemption. And that's the person we need to look out for. With that, I'm going to open it up for questions, for comments, for discussion, or other thoughts.
I had a question. Wasn't it odd that the two daughters-in-law were married for 10 years to Machlon and Chilion, and there were no children. Isn't that unusual in the Bible that they go for 10 years with no children?
Well, on one level, it is unusual in the Bible. But if you think about it, almost each one of our patriarchs dealt with issues of infertility.
Oh, yeah, right.
And maybe that is too, again, another central piece of that teaching, that out of infertility, out of struggle, out of comes new hope and new life ultimately, but it takes a long time.
Right.
I don't know Hebrews, but I remember reading somewhere that the names of each of the sons means something that has a meaning that refers to illness or weakness, or they were blighted young men to begin with, and their names.
And I think machalon means like sickness or something like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Helium.
I don't know what's the helion mean? Do you who knows what that means? I mean, the names, in other words, prepare you for their fate. The magic of their names, the power of their names. So, yeah.
It comes from the word for weakness.
Yeah. So they're impotent. They're impotent. They're sick. They were not good choices for husbands to begin with.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Others. Okay.
Hi, I'm curious how the rabbis that believe in the primacy of laws from the Torah, particularly those dealing with the Canaanites, you shall never deal with the Moabites or Ammonites, or you have to kill all the Amalekites. How do they, in the Talmud, wherever, deal with the obvious contradiction with Ruth's story and Boaz? They didn't have a rabbi giving any particular special permission for them to do what they did. How do they deal with this obvious contravention of God's authority, let alone their own, as rabbis?
Well, it's not contravention of their own authority, because that they would have been the rabbinic law. It was God's authority that they would have been struggling with. I think they just come to say, this is what happened, and they can't do away with it. I think part of them would say, well, she converted along the way, and therefore she ceased to be part of the Moabites. She became an Israelite in the process. Other than that, I'm not sure how they ultimately deal with it. Somebody else has seen a text on that?
I wonder whether they're told not to marry a Moabite even unto the 10th generation. How many generations was it from the time that was promulgated until this? It's not, it didn't happen as soon as they entered the land. So maybe they're able to somehow fiddle with it and say, this was the 11th generation. Right. I've never read that anywhere. I'm just making it up, but hey.
Works as well as anything else, Rabbi Stern.
So, Rabbi, if I can build on what Rabbi Stern just said, my understanding is, in certainly later rabbinic tradition, the answer is that these are archetypes that no longer exist. That once the land was settled, these other people cease to exist, so the laws no longer apply.
Great.
Well, I have almost the opposite kind of point of view about this. So you can actually look today at the Moabite stele. So there's a little bit of written evidence in Moabite. And the Moabite language and Hebrew are almost like this. The Moabite language is actually cognative Hebrew. And in those times, if you're speaking the same language as somebody, you're basically the same as the other one. And Moab, where's Moab? It's actually just across the river in Jordan. So I feel that the Hebrews and the Moabites, well, of course, our tradition makes them very different, but at one time they must have been almost the same thing for exactly these reasons.
They were physically close to each other. Their languages were similar languages. We know that many of the languages in that area, though, were cognates of each other.
Especially those two.
Yeah.
Those two are really close.
So how would the religious settlers interpret this story?
They would see it as, this is the story of Ruth, who becomes the great-grandmother of King David, that Ruth is a Moabite, but as David suggested to us, that was a people who didn't exist anymore. They were just archetypes. We don't have to take these stories exactly in that way. And it's really about getting us to King David.
Well, but part of your interpretation is that in the end, it's people who are more important than the land.
So you're asking a different question, Molly. You're asking for those who are in the settler movement and who are committed to preserving the land, for them, and here I'm going to obviously portray my political viewpoint, they don't see the other. The other, the primacy is on Jewish people, and the land was given to us, and we have the right to own the land, inherit the land, and control the land. We don't want to hurt the Palestinians, but we don't necessarily need to give them full and equal rights either. They're welcome to live there, but they can be second-class citizens.
Okay. Thank you.
But we'll destroy ourselves. No, right?
I couldn't hear what you said.
If we don't give Palestinians equal rights, and who but Jews should understand why everybody wants a home, And our Bible, the Quran, the Torah, and the Christian, there are 5,000 branches of Christianity. They all have similar landmarks or historic things. We're linked. Our religious books are linked. They're common events in all three of them. And we Jews who were exiled, we of all people should understand the Palestinians, I think. Sorry.
No, nothing to be sorry for. What you've just shown, and I think a viewpoint that is probably shared by many people on this Zoom call, is the perspective that we are coming from, and why we understand the need for there to be an independent Palestinian entity or state in the occupied territories in the West Bank. For Israel to be a Jewish state with Jewish values, for Israel to be a democracy, there needs to be something different, and we need to be able to separate from the Palestinians. And as Rabbi Hartman teaches us, and so many others teach us, that is ultimately where we want to go. There are others who say, why do we need to give the Palestinian rights? God gave us this land.
Why did the British need to give us the state?
Right. They didn't. They chose to.
There, for the grace of God, go I.
Yeah. The early settlers, Jewish settlers, and the Zionist movement, they literally sometimes didn't see the other there. There were back in like 1912, 1913, they took photos of all the great things that the Jews were doing to the land, when right behind them and totally ignored by the cameras were Palestinians, were the people that were
they
there.
They worked for the Jewish people until we outlawed that they couldn't. Forgot what was it? The law that they couldn't work for us. I don't remember.
So there were both viewpoints. There were those in the early settlers, or the early Yeshuv, who spoke about wanting to create a binational state, or how do we live in peace with the Palestinians? And there were those who said, we came to an empty land.
Right.
To rebuild it and to rebuild by it.
A people without a land found a land without people. Right, yeah. A complete empty desert.
But Rabbi, was that latter group of people blind, or were they lying?
They were lying.
I mean, they couldn't really believe that there was nobody there because there were people living there. You know, you can't pretend they're not. You can lie about it, but you.
The texts are filled with descriptions of the wars they fought.
Denial
they
ain't
also
only
worked
a
together.
river.
Just to be
Denial,
fair, the Jews and the Palestinians worked together
yes.
before the state of Israel was founded.
Yeah.
And they got along.
Yes, they did.
Denial is a nice place to be.
Denial ain't only a river in Egypt.
Exactly. You know, and I think part of what those of us on this call and those of us in the Progressive Israel Network are trying to say, we cannot live in denial anymore. We need to confront reality. And confronting reality means seeing the other as being created in God's image as we are created in God's image, and seeing the other as deserving of rights as we're deserving rights. And if we're going to be ourselves as Jews and maintain who we are, we need to maintain our morality, and to maintain our morality, we need to treat them in respectful, appropriate ways, as David Hartman would say, or we need to be able to say, the holiness of people is much more important than ultimately the holiness of the land.
I think the assassination of Rabin was such a consequential act. There was a real divide. It went towards the power shift that someone, Netanyahu, had supported the far right and then became the prime minister. There have been laws passed. There's been murder committed, uprisings, laws that are, I mean, if you look at a map, there's a Swiss cheese map for the Palestinians. The landscape is Kafkaesque, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And now there's a major threat.
So
will they ever work their way out of this? I don't know.
You know, we at J Street, we as American Jews, we have about 40 days, I don't know the exact count, left to try to say, how do we prevent this annexation happening?
Yes.
By speaking with our congressmen, with our senators, and putting our rabbis and our Jewish communal leaders and having them all speak out as loudly as they possibly can and send a message to the Israeli leadership. This is not a good plan for the sake of Israel. As Israeli security leaders have said, as the majority of Israelis have said, they're not in favor of an annexation.
Shin Bet has said.
The Shin Bet has said, exactly. It's no shortage of people who are opposed to it. We've got our work cut out for us. And that's what hopefully we can spend. After Shavuot is over, we can go back to that work once again.
So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I'd like to say something. Hello.
Sure.
I'm anti-annexation for sure. However, the Palestinians are not exactly an easy partner, and that is very unfortunate. They weren't really at the beginning of the state or when the Yishuv was there. They were Moraot, and there were all kinds of things. We're dealing not with a friendly nation.
So I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to end us by thinking two things. One is ultimately, who do I have to make peace with? I don't make peace with my friends.
That's right.
I make peace with my enemies. And the other piece I would argue is, while I do want to try to do this for the sake of the Palestinians, I also want to do it for the sake of my own neshama, for the sake of my own soul, so that I can preserve my soul, our soul as a Jewish people, and Israel as a Jewish state. Yes, it's going to be good for the Palestinians, but it's equally as important for the neshama, for the soul of Israel as a Jewish state and a Jewish democracy.
Good, I'm glad you said what you said.
And on that note, I'm going to wish everybody a Chag Sameach. And for those of you on the East Coast, a Laila Tov. For those on the West Coast, Shavuot will start in a little while. The sun is still out.
Chag Sameach, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.